The breaking point of fear. The drought calcified the valley, drying the other workers' wells and withering their crops to dust. But the smoke from Matilde's chimney continued to rise, and her children, though thin, did not have the sunken eyes of starvation. The villagers watched. They saw the subtle trace of moisture on the path leading to the hills, a path no one dared use. The rumors changed. She was no longer the favored of Don Herman. She was now something much darker. They whispered she was a witch who had made a pact with the whispers of the cave, offering her soul to the dead miners in exchange for the mountain's secret water. Herman Eldama heard the rumors, and unlike the superstitious workers, he knew the truth was much worse. His terror was absolute. He cared nothing for ghosts. He cared that she kept returning. Why? Was the water just an excuse? Was she ending? Was she looking for silver his father might have forgotten, or worse, was she removing evidence? His feverish mind imagined her working at night, chiseling at the brick wall, guided by the dead. She was not merely surviving, she was actively desecrating the scene of his father's crime, and every journey she made threatened to unearth the secret that kept him in power. He could not bear it. He rode to the house by the stream at dusk, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat, his usual composure as a landowner completely shattered. "Stop, Matilde!" He screamed without even dismounting, his voice high and trembling, unrecognizable. "What are you doing? Why do you keep going back to that mountain? The deal was silence. Do you want to ruin me? Do you want the entire valley to know what is up there?" His panic was so evident, so visceral, that he did not even notice Juan, now a tall, thin young man of 15 years, standing silently in the doorway with an axe in his hand, ready to defend his mother from the man who fed them. During the worst storm of the year, a widow with 8 children was forced to enter the cave that the entire town swore was cursed. With her baby burning with fever cradled in her arms, she ignored the warnings of the elders and crossed the threshold of what the valley people called the mouth of the whisper, La Boca del Suspiro. "Do not look inside. Just follow me," she whispered, her eyes filled with tears and her feet sunk in the mud. But what she heard echoing from within that darkness was not the sound of rain or wind. It was the rhythmic metallic clanging of something striking stone from the depths of the earth. And what she would discover at the end of that tunnel could never again be buried. Have you ever seen something in your life that could not be explained? Yes or no? Answer in the comments. The descent into darkness. The rain fell with relentless force on that afternoon in March, a day that felt somehow ancient, the year 1887 perhaps, though it might as well have been 1847. The weight of that year pressed into the bones of every living thing. It marked the end of planting season in the valley of San Gibran. And the sky had taken on a sickly purple hue, the color of morning itself, transforming 4 o'clock in the afternoon into an unnatural, premature night. Matilde stepped onto the porch, drying her hands on her tattered apron. She was thinner from the drought, but her eyes were hard as obsidian. She did not respond to his shouting. She simply turned, entered the shadowy interior of the house, and returned with the tin cup in her hand. The cup she had found in the stream 5 years earlier, the twin of the one she had seen in the tomb. She held it up slowly, the metal opaque and gleaming faintly under the purple light of dusk. "The stream is drying up, Herman," she said, her voice tranquil and deadly. "Things that were at the bottom are coming to the light." The threat was unmistakable. The past was not staying buried. The drought was revealing it. Matilde saw him blood drain from his face, watched it lose the last trace of color. He was ashen, then waxy as a corpse. It was a relic from the tomb, a physical messenger from the dead. She was not merely searching for water, she was finding things. The secret was unraveling, seeping like water from the mountain, and this woman was the vessel.
"Do not go back," he begged, his voice now that of a terrified child. The landowner vanished. "Do not return there. I will send more, twice the corn and water. I will send barrels from the estate's well every 2 days, whatever you need, but stay away from that mountain. Swear it to me, Matilde, swear it." She looked at him steadily. The man who had cast her into the mud now pleaded with her, offering not merely survival, but abundance, all to keep her away from his secret. The balance of power had inverted decisively and absolutely. She was no longer his prisoner, he was hers. "My children will not go thirsty again," she said. It was not a question, it was the term of his unconditional surrender. "I will send the barrels today," he said, defeated. The drought had not broken with rain, but with fear. Herman spurred his horse and fled, this time not from a defenseless widow, but from the living ghost she commanded.
The years of plenty. The years passed. The drought eventually broke, but Herman Aldama's routine never did. The barrels of water and sacks of corn continued arriving, month after month, year after year, long after necessity had faded. They became a silent tribute, a perpetual payment to the guardian of the tomb. Herman's workers brought them with mechanical precision, never meeting Matilde's eyes, as though ashamed to witness what their master had become. The children of Matilde grew strong on the land that was now truly theirs. Juan became a quiet man, the legal owner of the terrain, working the milpa that now flourished. Diego survived. His chest always bore that slight whistle, a living reminder of the cave water and that first cold night. Matilde aged in the house by the stream. Her silence became as deep and permanent as the stone of the mountain itself. She never returned to the mouth of the whisper. She did not need to. The power of the cave no longer resided within it. It existed in the knowledge she possessed. But the tin cup, the artifact of the dead miner, remained on the shelf above her hearth, beside the candle and the image of the Virgin. It was not a trophy of her victory. It was a constant reminder that her family's life had been purchased with silence, about 40 men, and saved by the desperate effort of one, the one who had carved 5 lines and a cross into stone. The legend endures. The valley of San Gibran maintained its legend. The mouth of the whisper remained a place of fear, a place where people said spirits groaned on stormy nights. But Matilde, the only one who knew the truth, understood that the only monster on that hill was human greed. She had descended into the tomb and found no ghosts. She had found strength to survive. She had used the crime of a man not to seek impossible vengeance, but to ensure the life of her children. And in that silence, in that terrible transaction, she had found the only justice possible for her sons and daughters. The question. The story does not end with triumph or with the conventional notions of justice. It ends with survival. Survival purchased at a price both exorbitant and cheap, depending on how one counts the cost. Matilde lived out her days in the house by the stream, her children raised on ground that was legally theirs, but felt like a long-term prison. Juan eventually married a girl from the neighboring village and worked the land with the same quiet determination his mother had instilled in him. Diego, forever marked by that first fever, became a craftsman, his hands always busy, always avoiding the hills. The twins grew into strong young men who understood, without being told, that certain topics were never discussed. Maria became a woman of few words, who turned away strangers and kept the house in meticulous order, a shield against chaos and exposure. Herman Aldama lived another 30 years, and those decades were a slow crucifixion of his conscience. The tributes continued, barrels and sacks, a constant reminder of his captivity to a widow who held his entire life in her knowledge. He never married again. His estate, though wealthy, felt hollow. He walked its corridors haunted not by ghosts, but by the certainty that somewhere, in a house by a stream, a woman lived who could destroy everything with a word. The workers on the Aldama estate spoke of him as increasingly detached, a man wealthy but profoundly alone, who spent his final years staring at the distant hills where the mouth of the whisper opened its dark maw. When he died, not dramatically, but quietly in his bed, attended by servants who did not love him, the tributes stopped. But Matilde did not need them anymore. By then, Juan's land had become productive, and Diego's crafts had earned reputation and coin. The house by the stream became a source of quiet pride. It was modest but solid. The garden flourished. The children grew and had children of their own. But the tin cup remained on the shelf, gathering dust, a silent witness that Matilde would occasionally look at, running her old fingers along its dented surface. Sometimes visitors would ask about it, and she would simply say it came from the river. But her eyes told a different story, a story of sacrifice, of terrible choices, of power gained through knowledge of others' sins.
The Eternal Echo. The legend of the mouth of the whisper persisted long after Matilde died, taken by illness at the age of 73, her hair white, her hands weathered by decades of work and worry. Travelers still avoided the path that led to the cave. Young people still dared each other to approach it at night, and their grandparents still told stories of men who had vanished in that darkness, of whispers that were not wind, but human voices crying out from stone. But the truth, the real truth of what lay within and what it had cost to know it, died with Matilde. Or rather, it was passed down in the form of a burden to Juan, who told Diego, who suggested to the twins that certain silences were precious and must be preserved. The tin cup became a family heirloom of sorts, not displayed proudly, but kept, passed down, a physical object that embodied the complexity of their family's salvation. Every generation would look at it and wonder, and every generation would choose, as Matilde had chosen, to keep the secret. In time, the Aldama family's fortune declined. Herman's descendants, lacking the ruthlessness or the strategic cruelty of earlier generations, gradually lost their dominion over the valley. The estate was sold in pieces, the granaries emptied, the power dissipated. But the mouth of the whisper remained. It remained sealed, it remained feared, and it remained a boundary between the known world and something else entirely. Something that only Matilde had truly seen and lived to tell about, yet chose not to tell. The valley eventually changed. New families came. The railroad came, and then the roads, and then the small town expanded beyond the valley into the surrounding hills. The superstitions faded, replaced by the practical concerns of a modernizing world. But the mouth of the whisper, perhaps because it had become less accessible as the world around it transformed, kept its legend. It was no longer necessary that people actually believed in its curse. The legend itself was enough to keep people away, to preserve its secret in the amber of fear and superstition. Epilogue: The Weight of Truth. Years after Matilde's death, a historian from the city became interested in the valley's folklore. He heard the stories of the mouth of the whisper, the legends of the whispering dead, and decided to investigate. he came to the house by the stream, where an elderly Juan still lived, a man in his 80s, his body bent with age, but his mind still sharp. The historian asked about the legends. Juan listened patiently, then invited the man inside. He offered him coffee and showed him the tin cup on the shelf. There is a story, but it is not for writing in books or publishing in newspapers. Some truths, the old man continued, looking at the tin cup with eyes that held depths of sorrow and complicated wisdom, are better preserved as silence. My mother understood this. She was offered the choice between justice and survival, between vengeance and pragmatism. She chose to keep her children alive. The historian asked if there was indeed a crime, if the legends had some factual basis. Juan did not answer directly. Instead, he stood with difficulty and walked to a locked wooden box. From it, he withdrew a document, a property deed signed by a notary more than 90 years previous, with the Aldama seal still visible. This land, Juan said, was purchased with a secret. The price was very high. But my siblings and I lived. We built lives. We had children and grandchildren. We prospered. He placed the document back in the box and looked at the historian with eyes that seemed to hold the weight of mountains. He said, "That is the only story I will tell. Some doors once opened should remain that way. Some secrets are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be respected." The historian left without the revelation he sought, but he left also with something else. The understanding that not all mysteries are meant to be illuminated, and that sometimes the greatest acts of courage are not in exposing truth, but in protecting those we love by bearing its burden ourselves.
The tin cup remained on the shelf. The house by the stream continued to stand. The mouth of the whisper continued to echo with its whispers, whether they were wind or the settling of stone or something else entirely, no one would ever definitively know. The final question. And so the story returns to where it began, to the prompt that opened this narrative. Have you ever in your life seen something without explanation? Have you ever come across something that defied the rational world? Something that could not be categorized or explained away? Something that marked you forever? Matilde saw such a thing in the darkness of a mountain cave. But what she saw was not a ghost or a demon or some supernatural force. What she saw was the capacity of human beings for both cruelty and cunning, for both wickedness and wisdom. What she saw was that the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead is sometimes much thinner than we assume, and sometimes the voices we hear crying out are not from beyond, but from within the walls we build around us. What she saw was that survival sometimes requires complicity, that justice sometimes demands silence, that power can be wielded not through violence, but through knowledge, and that a mother will traverse any darkness, enter any tomb, bear any burden to keep her children alive. The legend of the mouth of the whisper endured because it spoke to something true about the human condition, not the supernatural, but the natural human capacity for both darkness and light, for both sin and redemption, for both terrible acts and the equally terrible choices that follow them. And so the question remains, gentle reader, have you ever seen something without explanation? Something that made you question the world as you understood it, something that cannot be categorized or filed away, but must instead be lived with, carried within you, preserved in the silence of your own knowing. If so, perhaps you understand Matilde. Perhaps you understand why, when the notary left and Herman rode away defeated, she did not cry out in triumph or rush to expose the crime.
Perhaps you understand why she kept the tin cup on her shelf, why she bore the weight of the secret, why she chose survival over justice. For in the end, the greatest mysteries are not those that science cannot explain, but those that conscience cannot resolve. And the greatest courage is sometimes not in speaking truth to power, but in knowing when silence is the truest voice of all. The mouth of the whisper stands still, if it stands at all. The 40 men remain beneath the earth, if they were ever there at all. And Matilde Reyes lives on in the memories of her descendants, in the tin cup on a shelf, in the whispers of the wind through the hills of San Gibran, a woman who descended into darkness and emerged not with the truth exposed, but with something far more valuable, the knowledge that survival itself can be a form of victory, and that sometimes the greatest power lies not in revealing secrets, but in keeping them. The sound of the iron locks sliding shut in the darkness of their former home was the true thunderclap. The roar of the storm outside was only its distant echo. Just 1 hour before this moment, Matilda's brother-in-law, Don Herman Aldama, a man with cold eyes and a heart as dry as the corn he hoarded in his granaries, had pronounced their fate with the tone of a judge passing sentence. "Charity ends now, Matilda," he had said, his voice devoid of inflection, but cutting sharper than the wind itself. "The corn belongs to those who plant it, not to widows and their spawn." Herman had inherited the land when Matilda's husband died, and with that land came the absolute power to decide who would eat and who would perish under his shadow. The widow and her 5 children were merely useless mouths that diminished his profits, obstacles to his accumulation of wealth. The Aldama family had always taken what they wanted, and Herman saw no reason to deviate from that tradition. The air reeked of displaced mud, rotting straw, and the bitter stench of hopelessness. The men who worked for Herman, cowardly servants too afraid to meet Matilda's eyes, had thrown their few possessions from the small dwelling with brutal efficiency. The bed from her broken marriage, the dented tin pot that had fed her family countless times, Juan's small sandals, the single wooden trunk that held the clothing of her deceased husband, all of it now lay in a miserable pile beneath the relentless downpour, slowly sinking into the mud that consumed everything. Matilda watched the door to her former home, the only home she had ever known since her marriage, slam shut forever. The dry, decisive sound of wood striking the frame was a final blow that left her gasping, more from the sting of rejection than from the freezing wind that cut through her tattered clothes. They stood there, a tragic and motionless group beneath the deluge, staring at the closed door. The children did not cry. Shock had rendered them mute. They only trembled with those short, involuntary spasms that precede deadly cold. Matilda felt the dry cough of Diego vibrate against her own chest, a hollow, fragile sound like crystal about to shatter. With the absolute certainty that only a mother possesses, she knew the child would not survive the night exposed to the elements. The fever was consuming him from within, while the rain would finish him from without. She had to move. There was no time to mourn the lost home, only urgency for the life slipping away between her arms. "Where are we going, Mama?" whispered Juan, his voice broken by the chattering of his teeth. At 10 years old, he was trying desperately to maintain the composure of a man. Matilda had no answer. She looked around at the darkening valley, at the faint lights coming from other workers' hovels, but she knew that no door would open for them. The fear of Don Herman was thicker than the fog now descending from the hills. They were alone, completely, utterly alone. Without direction, Matilda began walking away from the valley, climbing up the muddy path that had become a stream of liquid earth. Each step was an effort. The mud sucked at her bare feet, and the weight of Diego seemed to double with every meter. The twins, holding each other's hands, stumbled and fell repeatedly, rising in silence, their faces smeared with mud and silent tears. Maria clung to her mother's skirts, her small hand frozen by cold. The storm intensified, transforming the landscape into a blur of dark greens and grays. The wind howled between the rocky outcroppings, a sound that seemed to mock their fragility. Matilda climbed on instinct, seeking shelter in the hills, moving away from the cultivated fields that now belonged entirely to her man. Diego's cough became drier, weaker, a death rattle that barely escaped his throat. Matilda stopped, panic constricting her own throat. She needed a roof, anything, an overhang, a crevice, shelter of any kind. That was when she saw it. Between the curtains of water and the swirling mist, a darker shadow on the mountainside caught her eye. It was a scar in the stone, the opening that the entire pueblo had sworn was cursed, the mouth of the whisper.
Even in her desperation, a chill ran through Matilde that had nothing to do with the cold. The mouth of the whisper. The elders would make the sign of the cross just saying its name. It was a place spoken of only in whispers beside the fire, a warning story told to children and travelers. No hunter would pursue prey that fled toward that crack. No woodcutter dared fell trees on that slope, afraid of awakening whatever slept within. The legend, ancient as the valley itself, claimed that the earth itself breathed through that dark opening, a cold breath that emerged even on the hottest summer days. It was a taboo, a boundary between the world of the living and something else entirely. The stories spoke of men who sought shelter from storms in years past and vanished, never to be seen again. Or worse, they had emerged at dawn, but changed, their eyes vacant, their souls hollow, murmuring about echoes and voices in the stone. The people of the valley preferred to ford the swollen river, risking the current, rather than take the shortcut that passed in front of that cave. They said that anyone who entered was claimed by the ancients, those who had lived there before the valley had a name. Their whispers, the stories insisted, joined with the wind on stormy nights, an eternal lament that warned the living. Matilde froze, her body paralyzed between ancestral terror and the urgent need to save her child. The legend pulled her backward, toward the rain that was slowly killing her. But then a lightning bolt illuminated the world, and in that fraction of a second of harsh white light, she saw Diego's face clearly. His lips had taken on a bluish tint. His eyes were closed. His breathing was merely a whisper. The fear of legend was a luxury she could not afford. Death by cold was a relentless certainty she held in her arms. The cave was a maybe. The storm was a definite ending. The choice, though terrifying, was clear. The instinct of a mother crushed 1,000 years of superstition. "Come, quickly, all of you get inside," she ordered. Her voice sounded strange, hoarse from the rain and her own determination. She pushed Juan and the twins toward the darkness that promised, at least, shelter from the merciless downpour. The children hesitated, their small bodies rigid with fear before the dark mouth, but their mother's tone admitted no argument. They entered, stumbling one by one, disappearing from the grayish light outside. Matilde went last, casting one final look at the storm that was erasing the world she had known, before plunging herself into the belly of the mountain, carrying Diego with his feverish heat against her heart. Darkness swallowed them whole. Inside the mountain. The interior was vast, so much larger than the narrow entrance suggested. The roar of the storm became a muffled murmur, as though the outside world now lay leagues away, cushioned by tons of stone. The darkness was absolute, so dense it seemed to have weight. Matilde took a tentative step on the irregular rocky floor. The air was icy, but still, with none of the wind's lash.
It smelled of wet earth, of limestone stone, of humidity trapped for centuries. But beneath that was something else, an acrid, almost metallic odor, like vinegar or oxidized iron, that made her skin prickle. A stifled whimper escaped from Maria, and the twins clung to Juan's legs, who, despite his trembling, maintained an upright posture. "Stay close together," she ordered. Her voice sounded strange, hoarse from the rain and her own determination. She pushed Juan and the twins toward the darkness that promised, at least, shelter from the merciless downpour. The children hesitated, their small bodies rigid with fear before the dark mouth, but their mother's tone admitted no argument. They entered, stumbling one by one, disappearing from the grayish light outside. Matilde went last, casting one final look at the storm that was erasing the world she had known, before plunging herself into the belly of the mountain, carrying Diego with his feverish heat against her heart. Darkness swallowed them whole.
The smoke made her cough, a thick, acrid smoke. But finally, a small orange flame licked at the damp wood. Instantly, the world reduced to that trembling circle of light. The cave walls jumped into view, rough, gray, dripping with moisture. The ceiling was impossibly high, disappearing into shadows her weak light could not penetrate. They were not in a small crevice, they were in the vestibule of something far more vast. They sat on the cold stone, huddling as close as possible to the struggling fire, which fought to stay alive. Matilde arranged Diego, removing her own rebozo, the only fabric she had that was almost dry, and wrapped it around him with force. The child whimpered weakly, his breathing a painful whistle. The fever would not break. His body's heat seemed to mock the sepulchral cold of the cave. Juan, assuming his role as the eldest, wrapped his thin arms around the twins, sharing what little warmth they possessed. Maria curled against her mother's back, her large eyes fixed on the dancing flames, too frightened to cry. For a moment only the sound of fire existed, the crackle of damp wood, the way each spark echoed back from the cave. Outside, the storm continued its rage, but here it was a distant murmur, the sound of the sea in a shell. Matilde closed her eyes for just 1 second, trying to steal an instant of peace amid the disaster. The smell of oxidized metal persisted, but now mixed with the smoke of green wood. She heard her children's breathing, irregular from fear and cold, but they were alive. The breathing of the living. Perhaps the legend was only that, a story to frighten children. That was when they heard it. It did not come from the entrance, it came from the deeper darkness of the cave, from beyond the reach of the fire. It was not the growl of a beast, nor the cry of wind. It was a metallic echo, rhythmic and deliberate, a dry strike, clang. Then a long silence so extended that Matilde thought she had imagined it. Then it came again, resonating through the stone. Clang. It was slow, tired, but undeniably deliberate, like a pickaxe striking rock, or a hammer on an anvil, but muffled by distance and stone. The sound seemed to freeze the blood in Matilde's veins. Her hand, which had been stroking Diego's fevered forehead, closed with a grip of iron. The children heard it too. The twins stopped trembling and went rigid with panic. Juan, his eyes wide with terror, stared directly at her. "Mama," he whispered, his voice breaking, "what is that?" Matilde brought a finger to her lips, demanding a silence that was already absolute. A silence now heavy with terrifying anticipation. The only human sound was her own heartbeat, hammering against her ribs as though trying to escape. But she spoke, her other hand slowly slid toward a bundle of wet clothing at her side. There,
wrapped in cloth, was the only kitchen knife she had managed to save from their eviction. A dull blade and a splintered wooden handle. A pathetic weapon against the unknown, but it was all she had. Her fingers closed around the cold handle, and the feel of steel gave her a tiny anchor in her ocean of fear. The sound continued, indifferent to her fear. Clang. A silence stretching for minutes. Clang. Inhuman in its persistence, devoid of any worker's hurry. It was methodical, almost funereal. Matilde did not move. The children did not move. They remained frozen around the dying fire, what seemed like an hour passing while they listened to that rhythm from hell. And then, as abruptly as it had begun, it ceased. The final clang resonated, its echo faded into the blackness, and the cave returned to its oppressive silence. But the silence was different now. No longer empty, it was full of the absence of that strike.
The new silence was worse. It was a silence that listened, that waited. Matilde remained motionless, every nerve taut, expecting the strike to return, but it did not. What did return was Diego's whimper. The child began to tremble with violent shudders, his body burning with fever, but his lips turning blue. Matilde knew the fire's heat was not enough. He needed clean water to bring down the fever, not the muddy water of the storm. Desperation gave her a courage she did not know she possessed. The descent into the depths. She looked into the darkness from which the sound had come. The fear of the unknown was terrifying, but the certainty of her son's death was intolerable. While Matilde tried to calm the whimpering children, Diego's fever worsened visibly. The boy no longer shivered from the external cold, now he convulsed in the grip of illness. His breathing was a short, sharp whistle, a terrifying sound that cut through the oppressive cave silence. Matilde knew it was not just the cold. This was a serious lung disease, the same sickness that had taken her own mother. She needed clean water, not from the mud outside, and she desperately needed to keep him warm and break his fever. Desperation gave her a courage that was cold and sharp-edged. She looked toward the darkness from which the metallic sound had come. The fear of the unknown was a shadow. The death of her son was a real, present weight in her arms. She turned to Juan. The boy of barely 10 years stared at her with mute terror, his enormous eyes reflecting the small flame. Matilde placed Diego in his arms, a feverish weight that made Juan stagger. "Mama, no!" he began to protest. Matilde gripped his shoulders with a strength that surprised him. "Keep the fire alive, Juan. That is your only task. Add dry wood, piece by piece. Do not let it go out. Watch your brother." She paused, her gaze locked on his. "No matter what you hear, no matter if you hear me fall or cry out, you do not move from this light. Do you understand? Your siblings need you." Juan, trembling from cold and the enormity of the responsibility, could only nod, his knuckles white as he clutched Diego against his chest. Matilde did not allow herself to hesitate. She grabbed the only kitchen knife, tucking it into her skirt's waistband. Then, from the fire, she took the largest burning brand, a thick branch, aflame with an orange smoking flame. The light was weak, barely a stain against the immense black, but it was all she had. She turned, and without allowing herself to look back at the 5 pale faces illuminated by the fire, ventured into the darkness. She followed the tunnel from which the sound had come. The floor was irregular and slippery. The darkness seemed to swallow the light of her torch, consuming the edges of the flame. The air changed almost immediately, becoming thin and heavy, difficult to breathe. That acrid smell which she had noticed upon entering intensified with each step. It was no longer just oxidized metal. Now it smelled of confinement, of stone dust, and something organic and rotten that she could not identify. The tunnel curved downward slightly. The only sounds were the constant dripping of water somewhere distant and the hissing of her own torch. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt her chest. But the sharp whistle of Diego's breathing was the only thought that drove her forward. She had to find clean water, a spring inside the stone. That was when her foot struck something that was not stone. She gasped and nearly dropped the torch. She lowered the light, her hand trembling violently. The object she had stumbled over was a pickaxe. It lay on its side, as though someone had dropped it mid-swing. The metal head was almost consumed by a thick crust of red rust. The wooden handle was broken, splintered, and rotted by moisture. This was the origin of the sound, the clang. But this pickaxe had not moved in decades. The sound she had heard was an echo, a phantom, or something deeper.
Fear transformed into a frozen mystery. She advanced a few more meters, her trembling light sweeping across the walls. That was when she saw the camp. It was a miserable scene. A rotted cot, whose strips of moldy canvas hung to the ground. Beside it, a dented tin cup overturned on the stone. Further on, the charred remains of an oil lamp, its glass broken like a black spider web. This was not a temporary shelter. Someone had spent considerable time here in this absolute darkness. The metallic smell was not just from the cave, it came from this place. The legend of the ancients faded, replaced by a much colder, more tangible truth. This had not been the work of spirits. Someone had lived here, or more likely, someone had died here. Matilde felt a wave of nausea, the stale air, the smell of decomposition she now recognized. It spoke of absolute loneliness. That overturned cup. The mouth of the whisper was not haunted by demons, but by human tragedy, one that felt terribly recent and desperate. The solitude of this stranger felt like a mirror of her own. But why? Who would work so deep in a cave that everyone feared? Who would hide down here? She looked at the oxidized pickaxe and then the cot. He was trying to get out. The realization chilled her blood more than the cave itself. Oh God, he was trying to carve his way out. How desperate would you have to be to attempt breaking through solid stone with only an oil lamp and a tin cup? The silence of the cave no longer seemed empty. It seemed filled with the effort and failure of this man. She continued forward, the need for water forgotten for a moment, replaced by the need to understand. The tunnel was not natural here. The walls were too straight, almost as if they had been carved. She advanced another 10 meters, through dripping humidity, and then the light of her torch struck something that did not belong. The tunnel did not end in a natural rock wall. It ended abruptly in a wall of bricks and mortar, a perfectly constructed wall that sealed the passage from floor to ceiling. It was not a collapse. It had been deliberately built. Matilde approached, the heat of her torch illuminating the crude but effective work. The bricks were dark, stained by moisture, but the mortar was solid. Someone had taken immense effort to seal this passage. This was not a cave. It was a mine, a sealed mine. And then, as she held the flame closer to examine the cement, she saw it, etched roughly into the mortar while it was still fresh. Right in the center of the wall was a symbol, a circle with a diagonal cross inside. She recognized that emblem instantly. She had seen it every day of her married life. It was on the iron gate of the main estate house. It was burned into the iron brands used to mark the cattle. It was the emblem of the Aldama family. Matilde stood paralyzed before the wall. The Aldama emblem carved into mortar from decades ago was an insolent signature over a crime. Her mind, feverish and exhausted, began to connect the dots with terrible clarity. The mouth of the whisper. The elders said the earth breathed, that laments were heard. But these were not ancient spirits. These were echoes. They were men. The man with the cot, the one with the oxidized pickaxe, he had not been digging to get in. He had been trying to dig his way out. And that sound, the clang, had been the echo of that last desperate effort trapped in stone. Or perhaps it was only the mountain settling over its dead. But the sharp whimper of Diego pulled her from her trance. The child coughed, a dry, wrenching sound that bounced off the stone. She had come for water. The wall, the secret, the Aldama emblem, all of that was a luxury. Her child's death was an urgency. She turned with the torch held high, her heart racing with panic. The air in this tunnel was unbreathable, a poison of stone dust and the sour smell of decomposition. She would find no clean water here. She retraced her steps, passing the rotted cot, passing the broken pickaxe that represented the grave of one man's hope. She returned to the main chamber where the small fire still burned. Juan looked at her. His eyes were two pools of terror in a face smudged with ash. "There is nothing," Matilde lied. But as her gaze swept across the chamber, she noticed something she had overlooked. Near the entrance, but on the wall opposite the mine tunnel, was another opening, much smaller, from which seemed to flow a fresher current of air. She followed the crack, which widened into a small niche, barely large enough for her to enter sideways, and there, at the bottom, she saw it.
A constant drip. Water. Clean water. Filtering directly through limestone. Dripping with a steady, musical rhythm into a small pool that had formed in the floor. It was a miracle. It was life. She fell to her knees. Without regard for the tin cup she had seen in that other tunnel, she cupped her trembling, dirty hands beneath the drip. The water was ice cold, almost painful, but it was pure. She let her hands fill, water overflowing between her fingers, and drank with a avidous urgency before refilling them again. She returned to the fire. Juan still sat immobile, a small soldier protecting his family. Matilde knelt beside Diego and, with infinite tenderness, brought her cupped hands to the child's blue lips. Water dripped into his mouth. Diego coughed. He choked, but instinctively swallowed. The long night. Matilde spent the rest of the night in a somber ritual. Every few minutes she made the journey to the niche, filled her hands with water, and dripped the life-saving liquid into her son's throat. She used her soaked sleeve to clean his burning face, then sat trembling while embracing her other children, trying to share a warmth she no longer felt. The night stretched into infinity, cold and fear without measure. The metallic clang did not return. The only sounds were the crackling fire, which Juan maintained with solemn devotion, Diego's wheezing breath, and the distant, dying roar of the storm that was finally moving away. Matilde did not sleep. She could not. She sat watching the shadows dancing on the cave walls, but she no longer saw ghosts. She saw the emblem of the Aldamas. She was no longer a widow fleeing the cold. She was a witness to a crime so deep and dark that it had been buried beneath a mountain. The confrontation at dawn. The first light of dawn was not a radiant sun, but a subtle change in the quality of darkness at the cave's mouth. The absolute black became a cold, pale gray. The rain had ceased. The world outside was wrapped in a dense silence, broken only by water dripping from the cave's edge. She was numb, her bones stuck to cold stone. But Diego continued to breathe. His fever had not broken, but the water had kept him alive. A fragile, tiny sprout of survival clung to barren rock. "Stay here. Watch the fire and your brother," she whispered to Juan. The child nodded, his eyes old in his child's face. Matilde stood, her muscles protesting every movement, and walked toward the cave's entrance. She needed to breathe air not tainted by smoke and secrets. She stepped onto the ledge. The valley of San Gibran was unrecognizable, drowning beneath a sea of thick white mist. It was a silence from another world. And that was when she saw him. Not a ghost, a silhouette. A rider standing motionless at the base of the hill, a black point against the ocean of mist. He was staring directly at the cave. Matilde's heart gave a violent start and then hardened like steel.
It was Herman. It had not been coincidence. He was not there hunting. How could he have known they were there? Had he seen the smoke? Or was the fear that they had taken shelter in the mouth of the whisper so great that he had come to check? She remained still on the ledge, a ragged figure against gray stone. Him down there, the owner of everything, on his horse. Her up here with nothing but 5 children and a deadly secret. For a long moment they only observed each other. Then Herman spurred his horse. The animal struggled to climb the muddy slope, slipping and snorting. It stopped about 20 meters from the cave entrance, close enough for Matilde to see his face. He was not angry as he had been the day before. He was pale, terribly pale. Panic swirled in his cold eyes. "Get out of there," he shouted, and his voice, usually so controlled, cracked. "Now, immediately, Matilde. That cave is prohibited. The earth is unstable. It could collapse." The lie was so flagrant, so desperate, it almost seemed comical. He did not fear for their lives. He feared what they had seen.
Matilde looked at him, feeling a cold, new power being born in her chest. The power of one who has nothing left to lose, but who possesses the only thing the other man fears. She looked into the darkness of the cave behind her, then at the sweating man in the cold morning. "It is not a cave," she said. Her voice was low, barely a whisper, but the acoustics of the hillside carried it directly to his ears. "It is a mine. It is a tomb." She paused, then struck the final blow, the question that would disarm him. "What did your father do here, Herman?" The face of Herman Aldama collapsed. It was not subtle, it was demolition. The pale color of his skin, already ashen in the cold morning, became waxy, and a layer of cold sweat burst from his forehead and above his upper lip. His eyes, once cold and calculating, became those of an animal trapped in a snare, moving erratically between Matilde's impassive figure and the dark mouth of the cave opening behind her. He swayed, gripping the saddle horn so hard his knuckles turned white, as though he feared falling from the horse. The mist rising from the valley seemed to cling to him, enveloping him, making him a diminished, phantasmal figure. You know nothing," he hissed, but the absolute lack of conviction in his voice was a confession in itself. It was the hollow sound of a man whose deepest secret, the rotten pillar upon which his entire life rested, had just been touched. Matilde did not move. She remained on the ledge, her bare feet sunk in frozen mud, her ragged figure standing with a dignity that the stone itself lent her. The hunger, cold, and fear of the past 24 hours had been transmuted into a glacial calm. She was no longer the exiled widow fleeing the storm. She was a silent judge, the voice of the mountain itself. "I saw the wall, Herman," she said. Her voice was flat and heavy as the blow of a hammer. "I saw your family's emblem sealing the stone with mortar. I saw the rotten cot of the man who tried to dig his way out." Each word was a shovel of earth over an open coffin, and she knew he heard her. She did not need to shout. The mountain's silence and the mist covering everything amplified her whispers, transforming them into a sentence Herman could not escape. Herman dismounted, or rather collapsed from his horse, his expensive leather boots sinking with a repugnant squelch into the same mud covering Matilde's feet. His legs trembled visibly. He looked nervously over his shoulder toward the mist-shrouded valley, as though the fog had ears, that the trees were witnesses. "It was my father," he finally whispered, the word father sounding like a curse, as though it burned his throat. "It was not my fault. I was only a child." The truth, contained for 30 years under the weight of the estate, began to pour out in a torrent of guilty, rapid whispers.
The people of the pueblo believe the legend of the whispers, but it is simpler. It is much worse. He passed a trembling hand across his face, wiping away sweat and guilt bursting from his pores. It was silver. It is always silver. My father, the old Aldama, he was not just a landowner, he was obsessed, a fanatic. Herman's voice now became monotonous, like a man reciting a confession long rehearsed in the darkness of his sleepless nights. He discovered a vein here on the mouth of the Whisper Land, a rich vein, pure silver. But this slope was communal land back then. Before he could arrange the property titles, he could not register the mine with the crown, so he did what the Oldamas have always done. He took what he wanted, in secret. He operated the mine under the veil of superstition, knowing no one would approach. He brought workers from other provinces, men with no names, no family known in the valley, bound by debts at the company store. He promised to pay them when all the silver was extracted. They worked for 2 years in that darkness, Herman whispered, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance as though seeing phantom men emerge from it. Almost 40 men, 40 souls who dug day and night like human moles extracting the wealth that built this estate.
Here, Derman swallowed dry and harsh in the humid air. But the main vein was exhausted faster than my father expected. It was rich, but short. My father did the math. He calculated the cost of paying them for 2 years of work, of freeing them. They were men who knew too much, who could talk, who could claim a share before a judge. He discovered it was far more costly to pay them and let them go than to silence them forever. Greed conquered blood. It was a night like this, Terman continued, his voice barely a thread. My father always used the storms to cover the noise of his worst acts. He told the miners there was a dangerous collapse at the main entrance on the other side of the hill, that he would bring help. But he did not bring help. He brought dynamite. He dynamited the main entrance, not once, but 3 times. He created a controlled collapse that sealed the mine's mouth forever. The men were trapped inside, alive, with their pickaxes, their oil lamps that would go out one by one, and the air that would end slowly, sealed alive under tons of rock. But my father did not account for this, Terman said, his trembling hand pointing toward the crack where Matilde stood. This was not an entrance. It was a ventilation shaft, a geological fault that nearly reached the surface. The men, in their desperation, must have felt the faint current of air. They must have tried to dig a way out. Matilde understood with nauseating clarity. The man with the cot, the one with the broken pickaxe, he had been the last. He had pounded, blow after blow, clang. The sound she had heard as a phantom echo until his strength gave out, dying of hunger or asphyxiation, mere meters from fresh air, only meters from where she now stood seeking shelter. The first days, Terman continued, trembling with violent chills now. There were strikes and screams. They came from the ground near the estate's corrals. My father forbade us from going near. He would beat us if we even asked questions. He said it was the mountain settling. But the strikes became weaker as the weeks passed. The screams turned into stifled laments. Then only whispers that seemed to seep out with the wind. The whispers at the mouth. They were them. They were men dying, scratching at stone. 40 of them. Their souls trapped beneath our feet. The fortune of the Aldamas, the estate, the cattle, Terman's power, everything was built on this mass grave. The corn he hoarded, which he had denied to Matilde's children, was fertilized with innocent blood. Terman looked at her now, not as a helpless widow, but as the embodiment of his ruin. The panic in his eyes mixed with abject supplication. He expected her to scream, to run to the pueblo, to denounce him to the priest, to seek the mayor. He expected the scandal that would destroy the Aldama name forever, that would not only exhume the dead, but unearth the fundamental lie upon which his wealth was founded. He who would cast her into the mud with the arrogance of a lesser god now knelt, metaphorically, in that same mud, awaiting judgment from the woman he believed he had destroyed. But Matilde did not scream. The absolute horror of the revelation had left her cold as the stone of the cave itself. The fate of 40 dead men weighed in the air, but not as heavily as the feverish body of her son. She looked past Herman toward the weak fire flickering in the darkness, where her 5 children, dirty, hungry, but alive, awaited her. One of them, Diego, fought for every breath. Justice for the dead was an abstract idea. The survival of her children was an immediate physical necessity.
She understood that Aldama's greed had taken everything from her, but it had also given her, without knowing it, the only weapon that mattered: the secret. The silence of the mountain now belonged to her. Matilde observed him in silence, allowing the confession to settle into the stale morning air, mixing with the mist and the smell of wet earth. The man who had stripped her of everything, who had looked at her with such casual contempt, now trembled, exposed, begging with his eyes. She felt the weight of the 40 dead men beneath her feet, their phantom whispers in the wind moving the mist. But stronger than justice for the dead was the feverish whimper of her own living child, struggling to breathe in the darkness of the cave. Herman's fortune, the corn in his granaries, the fine clothes on his back, everything was stained with the blood of those men and the rust of that pickaxe. She felt no compassion for him, only the cold of the stone and absolute clarity. He looked at her, waiting for her scream, her accusation, her condemnation. He expected her to run to the pueblo, to shout the truth, to unearth the scandal that would destroy him. But Matilde looked past him, toward the weak fire flickering in the darkness of the cave entrance. She saw her 5 children, dirty, hungry, terrified, but alive. Alive. Justice was a luxury for those with full stomachs and a roof over their heads. Survival was an immediate necessity, and the truth she had just unearthed was not a weapon for justice, it was a key to life. The silence stretched heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by water dripping and Herman's harsh breathing. Finally, Matilde spoke. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the mist like a knife. "My children saw nothing." Herman stared at her, his mind still tormented by phantoms. "And I," Matilde continued, taking a step toward him that forced him to instinctively retreat, "I heard nothing." The offer hung in the air, clear as a sentence. Silence in exchange for life. She did not want his silver, stained with death. She did not want to touch the wealth that came from that tomb. Greed was the disease of the Aldamas, not hers. But neither would she allow her children to die in the mud while he lived from this crime. "My children cannot live in the mud, Herman," she said, her voice gaining an icy strength. "We do not want your silver. We do not want your estate." Herman seemed to breathe for the first time, premature relief flooding his face, but Matilde had not finished. "We want the old house by the stream, the empty one, the one your old foreman used before he died." It was a modest request, an abandoned hovel on the edge of the lands, far from the main house, far from the mine. But it was a roof. It was a dry place where Diego could breathe. Herman, caught between the scandal that would destroy his family's legacy and the word of a widow who knew everything, understood the silent threat. She was not merely asking for shelter, she was dictating terms. But Matilde added one more condition, the one that would seal the pact and change her destiny forever. "And we want papers for that land. A piece of land to plant, not in your name, but in the name of my son Juan.
Papers signed by the notary. She did not merely want a roof, she wanted freedom. She wanted her children never again to be cast into the mud by the whim of an aldama. The landowner looked at her and for the first time saw the woman before him. She was not a helpless widow. She was a she-wolf protecting her cubs, willing to use any weapon. He saw the 40 phantoms of the mine standing behind her, whispering, supporting her demand. He knew he had no choice. Public scandal would destroy him. He would lose the estate, respect, the Aldama name. The word of this woman, backed by evidence of a brick wall, was enough to unleash hell. He nodded, a crude jerk, almost a spasm of defeat. "The house is yours," he rasped, his voice broken, "and the land. I will send for the notary today." Matilde looked at him for one more second, ensuring the defeat was complete. She saw no remorse in his eyes, only the selfish relief of one who had saved his own hide. She said no thanks. There was nothing to thank. This was not a gift, it was restitution. A house and a piece of land in exchange for silence about 40 murders. It was the cheapest deal Herman Aldama would make in his life. Without another word, she turned her back, a final gesture of contempt, and walked back into the darkness of the cave, leaving the landowner alone in the mist with his father's sins.
Part 2. The Years That Followed. She entered again into the circle of firelight. Juan looked up, his eyes full of questions and the fear of having seen her speak with the man who had cast them out. "He is gone, Mama," he whispered. Matilde went directly to Diego. The child was still burning, but his breathing seemed slightly less forced. The cave water had bought him time. "Yes," Matilde said simply. She turned to Juan. "Gather your siblings. Collect everything you can. We are leaving here." There was no triumph in her voice, only the infinite weariness of a battle won. They left the cave, not fleeing, but walking with purpose. Juan carried one sleeping twin. The other clung to Matilde's skirt. Maria walked at her side. Matilde carried Diego, his feverish weight a burden she accepted. Germain was gone. His horse had vanished into the mist like a bad apparition. The sun was beginning to burn away the fog, revealing a pale blue sky washed clean by the storm. She looked back one final time at the mouth of the whisper. The legend was wrong. It was not the whispers of the ancients that should be feared. What Matilde had seen that night in the cave was not a ghost, nor a monster, nor an ancient curse. She had seen something she had never imagined in her worst nightmares. Human greed in its purest, darkest form, solidified into a brick wall. And in the heart of that tomb, amid the smell of death and rust, instead of finding her own ending, she had found the only rotten key that could buy her family's survival. It was not justice, it was survival, and for now, it was enough. She began descending the hill toward the empty house by the stream, leaving the secret of the 40 men buried once more in the mountain silence. The new beginning. The descent from the mouth of the whisper was not a triumphant procession, but a somber one. Matilde carried Diego, whose feverish body remained a coal of sick heat against her freezing chest. Each step in the muddy slope was a risk, a possible fall that could be fatal for the child. Juan, with his 10 years, carried the weakest twin on his back, while the other, with little Maria, clung to their mother's skirt. They did not speak. The exhaustion and terror of the night before had emptied them. The children felt the gravity of the encounter with Germain, though they did not understand the transaction that had just occurred. They only knew that the man who had thrown them into the mud had now given them a place. And that contradiction was more confusing than fear of the cave. The valley, washed by the storm, smelled of raw earth and vegetable decomposition, a smell that Matilde would forever associate with the secret of the mine. The old house by the stream was a kilometer away, hidden in a bend of the river that the main estate no longer used. It was, as Germain had described, a hovel,
but it was a hovel with solid adobe walls and a tile roof that, though covered in moss, appeared mostly intact. It was a palace compared to the mud of the storm. Matilde pushed the wooden door, which opened with the complaint of rusty hinges. The interior smelled of dust, old wood, mouse nests, and the moisture of the nearby stream. It was the smell of abandonment, but a dry abandonment. It was a roof. It was a house purchased with silence, and Matilde felt it less as a refuge than as a different kind of cell, a place where she would guard her secret for perpetuity. The immediate priority remained Diego. The child barely had strength to cough. Matilde scanned the single room with her eyes. She found the most distant corner from the broken door, the driest spot. "Juan, find firewood. It does not matter if it is wet. Bring what you can. Maria, look for dry cloth in the bundles," she ordered. Her voice was flat, devoid of emotion, focused solely on the mechanics of survival. She found a stone hearth in a corner, covered with old ash. Using her last matches, her hand trembling, not from cold, but from accumulated exhaustion, she lit a fire using splinters from a broken chair she found in a corner. The flame caught, weak and smoking, but it was heat. It was life. The weight of secrets. That first night in the new house was worse than the night in the cave. The silence was different. In the mountain, it had been an oppressive silence, full of phantom echoes. Here, it was tense, expectant. Matilde did not sleep. She sat by the fire with Diego in her lap, listening. Every creak of old wood, every owl's cry from the stream made her start. She did not listen for the clang of a pickaxe. She listened for the imaginary sound of approaching horses, the click of a rifle being cocked. Did your man really intend to keep his word? Or, now that she knew, was she a witness too dangerous? The secret was a weapon, yes, but a weapon that could fire in both directions. It could ensure their survival, or sign their death sentence and that of their children.
Juan, curled beside her, could not sleep either. He felt his mother's tension like an animal. He looked at her in the gloom, watching the light of the fire carve deep furrows in Matilde's face. "Mama," he whispered, trying to understand a world of adults that had gone mad. "Why did that man give us the house? He hates us." The question was so simple and so devastating that Matilde felt a knot in her throat. She looked at her son, this small man who had been so brave, and she knew she could not burden him with the truth. The truth was a poison that only she could drink. It would be her armor and her cross, the burden she would carry for him. "Because he was afraid, my son," Matilde lied, her voice soft, stroking his tangled hair. "Not afraid of us. He was afraid of the mountain. There are things in those hills that are better left buried. He knows it. He wanted us far away from there, and this was the price." It was a partial lie, a pious lie that Juan could understand. Fear of superstition was something tangible. The child nodded, satisfied with the answer, and finally curled up as exhaustion overtook him. Matilde remained alone, more isolated than ever, in the fortress of her terrible knowledge. The price of silence. The next day, at noon, a cart arrived. It was not driven by Herman, but by one of his workers, a man with an impassive face who avoided Matilde's gaze. He was one of the same men who had thrown their possessions into the mud 2 days before. Without saying a word, he began unloading sacks on the improvised porch. Corn, beans, a sack of potatoes, a bag with salt, brown sugar, and a piece of lard. 2 rough wool blankets. It was the first payment for her silence. It was the price of 40 souls. Matilde received everything with cold dignity, without saying thank you, without showing relief. The man left as quickly as he had arrived, as though he feared becoming contaminated. With a roof over their heads, a constant fire, and real food, Matilde began the true battle for Diego's life. She ground the corn in a broken metate and prepared hot atole sweetened with brown sugar. She forced the warm liquid into the boy's throat, drop by drop.
For 2 days and 2 nights she did not leave his side, kept him warm with the new blankets, cleaned his face with water from the stream, and prayed, not to a God that felt distant, but to life itself, to the stubborn flame that burned in her son's chest. On the 3rd dawn, the miracle occurred. The fever broke, the whistle in his chest became deeper breathing, and Diego opened his eyes, asking for water with a hoarse whisper. Matilde cried for the first time, silent tears that dried instantly from the heat of the hearth. The bitter harvest. As Diego's health improved, Matilde's immediate panic dissipated, only to be replaced by the crushing reality of her pact. The relief of survival had a bitter taste. She looked at the sacks of corn stacked in the corner. That corn had been planted by Herman's paid workers with money from the mine. It was corn grown on blood-soaked earth. Every bite she and her children ate felt stained. She felt like a ghost living in a house haunted by phantoms. The mouth of the whisper was no longer a physical place on the mountain. It was a dark crack she now carried in her own soul, a secret that fed her and poisoned her simultaneously. A week after their arrival, Herman appeared again. He did not come alone. He brought with him the pueblo's notary, a thin man with thick glasses who did not stop sweating and who looked at Herman with evident terror. The notary asked no questions. He unrolled a parchment on the rough wooden table. Herman, with a trembling hand, signed.
Then Matilde called Juan. "Sign here," said the notary, his voice trembling. Juan, with his 10 years, took the pen and with difficulty traced the letters of his name, Juan Reyes, where the man indicated. He was the owner of 4 hectares of land and a house by the stream. Germán handed the paper to Matilde, his hands avoiding touching hers. There were no words. The exchange itself was Matilde's victory, and holding the title of property, she knew that paper was her salvation and her eternal curse, sealed with the silence of 40 dead. The sealed pact. The crispy official paper, with the notary's seal still wet, felt strangely heavy in her hand. It weighed more than the axe, more than the sack of corn. It was the weight of silence itself. With that document, Germán had bought not only her silence but her existence. They had ceased to be a problem to be disposed of and became instead a living reminder that had to be maintained. Matilde folded the paper carefully and kept it in the only safe place she had, sewn into the interior of her skirt against her skin. Every time she moved, she felt the parchment, a constant reminder that her freedom was purchased with earth covering 40 men. The house by the stream became her world, a 4-hectare island surrounded by the ocean of Aldana power. It was a cage with a large courtyard, and she knew it. Life settled into a hard routine, marked by sun and seasons, but above all by fear. Matilde became a shadow of herself, but a productive shadow. With silent ferocity, she and Juan began working the land they had been given. It was not the best earth in the valley. It was full of stones and too close to the stream, prone to flooding. But it was theirs. With bare hands and an oxidized pickaxe they found in the shed, they tore out weeds, removed stones one by one, building fences with them. They planted the corn and beans that Germán sent them. The irony of planting grain stained with blood on earth purchased with blood did not escape Matilde. Every seed she buried felt like she was helping Germán bury his secret even deeper. The whispers of the valley. The rest of the valley noticed the change quickly. The widow Matilde and her 5 children who had been cast into the mud and given up for dead had reappeared. Not only that, they occupied the old foreman's house and were rumored to have food from the estate. The other women of the workers who would have offered Matilde a hot broth out of compassion before, now looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and envy. What had this widow done to earn Don Germán's favor? What kind of deal had she struck in the darkness of that stormy night? The looks became cold and whispers followed her when she went to wash her clothes at the stream.
whispers that spoke of witchcraft, of indecent favors, or that she was allied with the spirits of the mouth of the whisper. The cave had saved her, but it also marked her, separating her from her own people. Matilde did nothing to deny the rumors. Isolation was, in a way, a protection. She closed herself off, into herself and into her children. She taught them not to speak to anyone in the pueblo, to lower their eyes, not to respond to provocations. They became a family of ghosts, silent and hard-working, living on the edge of the valley, always watched, never understood. Juan grew quickly in that silence, losing the last vestiges of his childhood. At 10 years old, he wielded the hoe with a man's strength, his thin shoulders tense with responsibility. He was the owner of the land and felt the weight of that title, though he did not completely understand how he had obtained it. He only knew that his mother had done something terrible or miraculous in that cave, and that their survival depended on asking no questions. Germán fulfilled his part of the pact with terrifying precision. They never lacked the basics. Every first day of the month at dawn, the same faceless cart appeared at the border of their property. It left a sack of corn, lard, and salt. Never more, never less. It was a ration of silence, a pension of guilt. Germán did not want them to starve. The dead cannot keep secrets. But neither did he want them to prosper. The prosperous gain voice. He kept them in a purgatory of subsistence, alive enough to remind them of their debt of silence, poor enough that they could never leave and tell their story. Matilde accepted the supplies with the same coldness with which she received them. It was the price of her silence, and she was a very expensive jailer. Diego recovered, but the illness left its mark. His breathing would always have a slight whistle, a constant reminder of the night in the cave, of water dripping from stone. He grew as a quiet child, clinging to his mother, with an instinctive fear of the hills. Sometimes, when the wind blew hard from the direction of the mouth of the whisper, the child would wake up crying, saying he heard men hammering beneath his bed. He would hold him, her own heart frozen, lying to him that it was only trees. But she heard them too, not in the wind, but in the beating of her own blood, the clang-clang of the oxidized pickaxe she had found in the darkness.
The artifact from the tomb. Time passed, and the secret solidified, becoming part of the landscape itself. One day, while repairing the stone fence that Juan had built, Matilde found something in the stream mud. It was half buried, an object of discolored metal. She pulled it out. It was a tin cup, identical to the one she had seen next to the rotten cot in the mine. It must have been carried by some underground current connecting the sealed mine to the stream. The cup was dented, but it was tangible proof that Moano had escaped the tomb. She felt a shiver run through her spine. The past was not dead. It was not even buried as deeply as Germán believed. She looked at the cup in her hand, the metal cold against her palm. She could have thrown it to the bottom of the stream, let the water cover it forever. She could have buried it beneath her own hearth, but instead she cleaned it. She cleaned it with sand from the river, until the opaque tin recovered a ghostly shine. She did not hide it. She brought it to her house and placed it on the wooden shelf above the hearth, in view of all, but without explanation. She placed it beside her only candle and the small image of the Virgin she had saved from the eviction. It was a strange altar, faith, light, and crime all together. It was a silent reminder to herself, and perhaps a question for Germán, if he ever dared cross her threshold. The breaking point. And then the routine broke. It happened 5 years later. The children had grown. Juan was a strong adolescent of 15 years. Diego was 7. The twins and Maria were now efficient workers on their small plot. The house by the stream was poor but clean, and was a home. They had managed not only to survive, but to create a bubble of life. But the drought that year was brutal. The sun calcified the valley.
the stream reduced to a thread of muddy water. Their milpa, planted with such effort, withered, leaves yellow and brittle. The corn that Herman sent each month was no longer enough. For the first time since the pact, famine approached their door. Matilde knew that asking Herman for more was dangerous. It would break the balance of their agreement. He kept her alive, but not prosperous. Asking for more was a form of renegotiation, and she knew what happened to people who renegotiated with the Aldamas. But her children, especially Diego, who had always been weaker, began coughing again. Their bellies swelled from lack of food. Desperation, the old familiar, returned. She knew she had to do something. She could not go to Herman and beg, for begging would put her on her knees, breaking the silent pact that kept her upright. The landowner gave her enough to survive, not to prosper. And in a year of drought, survival required more. No, she would not ask the man who created her cage. She would go to the only place that had offered her life when the world offered death. She would return to the mouth of the whisper. She would return to the mine. Fear was a cold knot in her belly, but the hunger of her children was a fire that burned everything. The mountain held the secret, the tomb, and the water, and she would go to take what she needed. She waited until the moon was only a broken fingernail in the sky, light weak enough to hide her movement. She left Juan in charge, now a young man of 15 years, thin but strong, who understood the world through his mother's silence.
I am going for water to the mountain. No matter how long I am gone, keep the door locked and the fire low, she told him. Juan nodded, terror in his eyes, but obedience in his posture. Matilde took 2 clay jars, the weight of their emptiness an insult to her effort. The climb was different this time. There was no storm, no panic, only cold determination and knowledge of every stone. The trail, abandoned for 5 years, was almost erased, but her feet remembered the path her mind had tried to bury. Standing before the cave entrance again was itself an act of violence against her own soul. The air emanating from the darkness was the same, cold, stagnant, with that sour smell of oxidized metal and something deeper, something that smelled of confinement and stopped time. It was the breath of the 40 dead and the tomb of the pickaxe man. For a moment her knees weakened. Returning here felt like a betrayal, like tempting the fate that had forgiven her once. But then she heard the weak whistle in Diego's chest, an echo in her memory that drove her forward. She lit her torch, and for the second time in her life, Matilde Reyes entered the mouth of the whisper, this time not as a refugee, but as a thief. The strength of the guardian. The main chamber was exactly the same, a vast hall of shadows that her small torch barely wounded. She saw the circle of blackened stones where Juan had maintained the fire, an improvised altar to their desperation of that night. The silence enveloped her, but now she did not feel it as oppressive. It felt like something that recognized her. She was the only living person who knew the truth of this place. She was the guardian of the secret, the involuntary priestess of this tomb. The air was heavy, but she breathed, knowing that her presence here was a right she had earned with blood and fear. She was no longer an intruder. She was the owner of the secret. She ignored the main tunnel. She did not need to see Herman's brick wall again. The emblem of the Aldamas was branded into her memory. She did not need to see it carved in stone. Her objective was the other crack. She headed directly to the lateral niche, that narrow fissure that had been her miracle. The sound, even before she reached it, calmed her. The constant drip. Pluck, pluck, pluck. It was the most beautiful sound in the world, the antithesis of the metallic clang. It was the sound of clean water filtering through the mountain, indifferent to drought, to men, to death.
She knelt with a sigh that this time was her own, a sigh of absolute relief, and drank directly from the pool. The water was so ice-cold it hurt, but it was pure life. She filled the first jar. The sound of water gurgling into the clay vessel was a desecration in the sepulchral silence, the noise of life in a place of death. As she filled the second, the sensation of being watched returned more strongly than before. Not the fear of a ghost, but the awareness that she was not alone, that this place belonged to others. It belonged to the man with the rotten cot. It belonged to the 40 men sealed behind the wall. She was not taking water from the mountain. She was taking water from a tomb, and they were watching her in silence, allowing it, or perhaps simply waiting. As she gathered the second jar, her torch illuminated something she had not seen in her panic the first night. Right beside the spring, on the wet wall of the niche, was a mark, not the emblem of the Aldamas. It was a crude carving made with the point of a knife or sharp stone. 5 vertical lines and 1 horizontal line crossing them. A tally. 5 days. 5 weeks. Below it, barely visible, a crude cross. It was the mark of a man, the mark of the tunnel man. Had he found this water, or had he died of thirst only meters away in the tunnel's foul air? The idea struck her with the force of a physical blow.
With the water secured, a new weight settled on her shoulders against her will. She found herself turning toward the mine tunnel. The smell of rust palled to her. A part of her, the part now linked to this place, needed to see. She took a few steps into the darkness, her torch pushing back the blackness. The air became heavier, harder to breathe. She saw the cot in the distance, a pathetic silhouette. She felt the desperation of the man who had died there and stopped. No, she could not. She had no right. Visiting his tomb would be a desecration. She was there for life, not to poke through death. She turned around, her heart hammering with a mixture of pity and terror.
The breaking point of fear. The drought calcified the valley, drying the other workers' wells and withering their crops to dust. But the smoke from Matilde's chimney continued to rise, and her children, though thin, did not have the sunken eyes of starvation. The villagers watched. They saw the subtle trace of moisture on the path leading to the hills, a path no one dared use. The rumors changed. She was no longer the favored of Don Herman. She was now something much darker. They whispered she was a witch who had made a pact with the whispers of the cave, offering her soul to the dead miners in exchange for the mountain's secret water. Herman Eldama heard the rumors, and unlike the superstitious workers, he knew the truth was much worse. His terror was absolute. He cared nothing for ghosts. He cared that she kept returning. Why? Was the water just an excuse? Was she ending? Was she looking for silver his father might have forgotten, or worse, was she removing evidence? His feverish mind imagined her working at night, chiseling at the brick wall, guided by the dead. She was not merely surviving, she was actively desecrating the scene of his father's crime, and every journey she made threatened to unearth the secret that kept him in power. He could not bear it. He rode to the house by the stream at dusk, his face pale and glistening with cold sweat, his usual composure as a landowner completely shattered. "Stop, Matilde!" he screamed without even dismounting, his voice high and trembling, unrecognizable. "What are you doing? Why do you keep going back to that mountain? The deal was silence. Do you want to ruin me? Do you want the entire valley to know what is up there?" His panic was so evident, so visceral, that he did not even notice Juan, now a tall, thin young man of 15 years, standing silently in the doorway with an axe in his hand, ready to defend his mother from the man who fed them.